In this presentation, which is going to be part of a series, we're going to be looking at the crafting or writing of the Constitution, its ratification to replace the Articles of Confederation as our new Constitution, and then we will look to the various ways the Constitution can be changed. And we're going to start off with what should be review if you've already completed the reading, in which you learned about 3 areas of controversy. And we'll cover 2 here, and we'll cover 2 at the end of this particular lecture. So the first, controversy A, was about equality. And this kind of stems from something that's called the American Creed, which for those of you who will be taking the AP exam is something that is highlighted in some of your content. And the American Creed means different things in different contexts, and you'll hear people talk about it with different meanings in those different contexts. But here, the American Creed is the idea that all people are equal in the rights they're born with, and that the government's purpose, the reason the government is created, is by the consent of the governed to protect their rights. And the idea is everyone's equal in their rights. The government that we create should protect those rights equally. And in terms of this controversy, kind of need to think about it a couple of different ways. And first, we're going to talk about representation in the government, elected representatives. Remember, in republics, we signify our consent to be governed by voting to elect representatives. By participating in that process, right, voting for who we want to win, we accept that we will be governed by whoever is the winner, even if it's the person we didn't vote for. But the question that the framers had, or the founders, however you want to think of them, was how should the people, and at this point, importantly, the states, be represented? And I say the states because what we have to remember at this period in American history, a person's loyalty to the state was often stronger than their loyalty to the United States. That would be many people, if not the typical view was that a person's loyalty was primarily to the state they lived in, probably the state they were born in, right, and secondarily to the United States. During this time period, a lot of people will talk about the United States in plural, refer to these United States, instead of what most likely you refer to as the United States. Of course, your reference being singular and the previous again being plural. And this is where we get to the plans for representation. And there are 3 of them. The first we'll talk about is the New Jersey Plan. The name you need to associate with that is William Paterson. And the New Jersey Plan is the least departure from the government under the Articles of Confederation. The national or central government is going to remain relatively weak. However, it would have key powers that had been absent in the Articles of Confederation. One of those being taxation. Instead of asking the states for tax contributions without any means of enforcement, this would have the power to require those taxes be paid. And it would also have a stronger power to regulate interstate trade. As remember, this has been one of the problems under the Articles. We have states blocking trade with each other, imposing tariffs on trade with each other, and that was that thing that, more than anything else, was a threat to the unity of the country as a whole. It would retain the Articles' unicameral legislature, and it would retain within that unicameral legislature equal representation for the states. So no state would have any more voting power than the others. Again, that would be like the Articles of Confederation Congress. This would have a plural executive, and remember, the Articles Congress have had a rotating executive that would be selected from the membership of the Congress. This was going to be a bit different, so there would be not a single executive like we have today with a president, but there would be a small group serving as the executive, and the members would be selected by the legislature. It's not voted on by the people, but picked by the legislature. And those people would not serve a fixed term necessarily because they were removable by the legislature. If this sounds kind of parliamentary in that sense, that would be a useful comparison. The judiciary would not be a complex apparatus, and its membership would also be, would be appointed by the executive. So the legislature chooses the executive. Those members of the executive would in turn appoint members of the judiciary. The second plan we have, authored by the much better known James Madison, would be a very strong national government. You'll be able to see stronger than the national government that we have currently, at least in some respects. And the most apparent of those respects is that it was going to be clearly superior to the state governments, to the point that it could take over the functions of those state governments if the national government deemed that that was appropriate or necessary. It was going to have 3 separate branches, and remember here, we've mentioned this before, we'll reinforce it as we go. Baron de Montesquieu was one of, if not the primary influence on James Madison in his thinking about how to structure government. And this is built on Montesquieu's idea of the importance of separation of powers. And remember, as we think about separation of powers and checks and balances, separation of powers logically precedes checks and balances. If you don't have branches with their own separate functions and their own separate powers, you cannot have a system of checks and balances. And his idea was to design it such that they would use their separate powers in ways to counterbalance each other by checking one another's powers. And we will see how that works as we get more into the Constitution itself. But here again, we have methods for selection that are going to look in some ways reminiscent of the Articles of Confederation. And here we are going to have actual separate branches instead of Congress providing its own executive and judicial functions, but Congress is still going to pick the leadership for the 2 other branches. Okay, so the legislature will still pick the leadership of the executive and judicial branches. In contrast to the New Jersey plan, the legislature, the Congress would be bicameral, which means 2 chambers, unicameral, of course, meaning 1 chamber, kind of like a unicycle versus a bicycle, right? 1 wheel versus 2. Some students kind of find that to be a helpful illustration. And in another departure from the New Jersey plan, the representation in both chambers would be based on either population or tax contributions to the national government. And remember, this idea of tax contributions to the national government had been a subject of debate between the northern and southern states, with northern states wanting it to be based on population, and the southern states wanting it to be based on something else, like land values. Because remember, that if we're basing taxation on population, and we count slaves as part of that population, which the South did not like, southern states would pay a relatively higher rate of tax compared to northern states. The House, which would be the lower chamber, and as we have under our current Constitution, the House is also the lower chamber, that would be popularly elected, meaning that the people in the states would directly elect the membership of the House. They would see names on a ballot. They would pick the name. If the name they pick ends up getting the most votes, that person would go to the House to represent the people. The Senate, which in this plan and in our current Constitution was the upper chamber, would be chosen by members of the House. So that would be indirectly elected. And to kind of add a complication to this, but also to ensure the influence of the states, the candidates for the Senate would have to be nominated by the legislatures of the individual states, and then in turn selected by the membership of the House. And so with those two plans, we see the stage is set clearly for conflict over the basis for determining how much representation states would have in Congress. The question is, do we have proportional representation, as we see in the Virginia plan, where it's likely to be based on population, or are we going to have equal representation, as proposed in the New Jersey plan, where all states will have the same voting power in the Congress? Small population states, like New Jersey, naturally favored the New Jersey plan. It was going to ensure their continued influence in the national government. Large population states like Virginia, and I know we don't necessarily think of Virginia as a large population state, especially not today. We think of California, Texas, New York, Florida as large population states. In the original 13, however, Virginia was a heavyweight in population, and large population states like Virginia favored the Virginia plan's proportional representation. Of course, as you probably already figured out in looking at both of the plans and noting my discussion of how they differ from the government we actually have, something had to give. And what gave was a compromise that we refer to as either the Connecticut Compromise or the Great Compromise. And the primary person behind that is Roger Sherman, who just looks like a very fun guy with a great zeal for life. And as I make this joke, I also have to remember that when one of my children walked into the room while I was working on this, pointed out, Daddy, that guy looks an awful lot like you would look if you shaved off your beard. So I guess the joke's on me for pointing out that he is such a dour figure. Anyway, back to the Connecticut or Great Compromise, and you should remember it by both names just in case. In this plan, we keep the bicameral Congress of the Virginia plan, smaller upper chamber, which is going to be the Senate, much like we've already seen. In the Senate, there would be equal representation for the states. New Jersey, Virginia have the same voting power, the same number of voting representatives. And that formula was going to be the formula we ultimately have today. 2 senators for each state, whether we're talking about teeny tiny Wyoming or a large population state like Florida. Each gets 2 senators. And the lower chamber, of course the House, that would have representation apportioned according to the population of a state. And remember, always think about these as the upper chamber and the lower chamber. If you remember from way back at the beginning of the course, I suggest you think of these as clubs, with the Senate being the more exclusive club and the House of Representatives being the less exclusive club. That can kind of help create mental shortcuts to sorting out the different features of the two. There would be a strong central government, not as strong as the central government under the Virginia plan, but stronger than in the New Jersey plan. And one thing I do also want to note, and this is something we'll come back to when we talk about the Congress in more detail, although the Connecticut Compromise really seems to be a balance between population-based versus equal representation formulas, the ultimate effect that was to some extent recognized at the time is that small states remain overrepresented in Congress, specifically in the Senate. And that's going to have kind of long-lasting consequences, but again, we'll get to those more when we talk about the Congress in detail. There was also a round two to the equality controversy. How should we actually determine what the population of a state is? And here, as we saw previously in discussions about how taxes are going to be apportioned, the question is whether slaves are going to count as part of a state's population. And here we see a reversal. The southern states now want slaves to count as part of their population. Remember, they had not wanted that at all when slaves counting towards population might have increased the tax contributions they were supposed to make to the central government under the Articles. And northern states now oppose counting slaves. They realize that will increase the voting weight of the southern states. So the compromise we have, which in hindsight, maybe at the time, looks very cynical, is the 3/5 compromise. And so here we meet the first of what I will refer to throughout the years are magical fractions, fractions that you need to remember. And 3/5 is something we'll see a couple of different times, but this is primarily how you are likely to be asked about something involving a 3/5 fraction. And the idea here is, in the Constitution, free persons, so people who are not slaves, will count as a whole single person. As the Constitution puts it, all other persons will be counted as 3/5 of a person for the purposes of representation. Now, I put this in quotes. This is what the Constitution says. There is no actual mention of slaves when we talk about this other basis for apportionment. They simply refer to them as all other persons, but everybody knows that they're talking about slaves. Population would determine representation in the House. This is the win for the South. It's going to increase their voting weight in the lower chamber of the legislature. Now, the North also thinks that they have gotten something in this compromise because in the Constitution it's written that this determination of state population would also be used to calculate direct taxation imposed on states, meaning taxation the states themselves would have to pay to the national government. Now, as it turns out, the joke is on the North. No such direct taxation has ever been levied on the states. Some of it is because the mechanism for that is complicated. Some of these questions have also wound up in Supreme Court cases, but the key upshot for you is the South wins on representation and does not lose on taxation. The North does not extract what they think they are in terms of getting a compromise with the South. And if this all seems kind of hypocritical on the part of the South, where we don't want slaves to count and now we do, or you could also say hypocritical on the North. They had wanted to count them before, now they don't want to count them. That is the reality. But what we get is the 3/5 compromise. Okay, and that helps with the finishing of the drafts of the Constitution and ultimately with its ratification. And from there, we move to controversy B, and that is trade or commerce and the slave trade specifically. And a lot of this area stems from fears on the part of the South. One of the things the South was afraid of is that the new federal government, new central government, stronger central government, would pay for some of its debts. Remember, debt is a big problem for the national government after the Revolutionary War and stemming from the problems of paying debt under the Articles. So the southern states are afraid that this new national government that is created partly because we need more and better taxation to pay for things is going to result in export duties or export tariffs. And now we hear a lot of talk about tariffs right now in terms of U.S. foreign policy, U.S. trade policy. What we're talking about there is taxes on imports coming into the United States. And that is, as tariffs go, those are the tariffs you are going to see, or taxes on imports. States have much less incentive to tax their own exports. Again, what the South was afraid of was that the national government might use those export duties to meet the pretty desperate need of the central government for sources of revenue. Now, why is it that the southern states are so concerned about this and not the northern states? Well, southern states are the ones that are really involved in international commerce. And that's because of the nature of their agriculture. The South doesn't really manufacture very much. Their source of income for their economies is exports of cash crops. Cash crops are things you grow to sell, not to eat. In the northern agricultural economy, the focus is much more on food crops like wheat or corn, rye, barley. Not all of that gets eaten. Some of that gets turned into beer and whiskey, but it's otherwise consumed by the people and by the people where they live. The South grows cash crops, which again are crops to sell, cotton and tobacco. Those of you who are thinking back on your U.S. history class, cotton's the one that jumps out at you. And later, cotton will become what's known as king cotton. But in this time period, tobacco is the major cash crop. And in any case, the southern states are afraid that the new central government is going to tax their exports of those crops, which will hurt the South. If their crops are more expensive to consumers in Britain, those consumers will buy less of it, which will hurt the economies of the southern states. The southern states also feared interference in one type of trade particularly, and that is the slave trade. Slaves are being imported from West Africa, some also from the Caribbean or even South America, and the southern states are afraid that a new federal government might be influenced by the North, by anti-slavery interests, into restricting the importation of slaves. They're also worried about, and this kind of often gets overlooked, that the national government would somehow impose restriction on the selling and buying of slaves between two different states in the country, or even perhaps people's ability to move with their slaves from one state to another. And you might not think of farmers in this time as being a particularly mobile bunch, but cotton and especially tobacco, not a farmer, but my understanding is tobacco is a much worse crop in this regard. Both of them strip the soil of nutrients. And farming practices in this time period not being the best for long-term sustainability, the soil tends to get exhausted where you've been growing these cash crops. And so farmers would take their whole household, including their slaves, and they often moved west, especially later on to places like Texas, to find new land to plant with their soil-depleting cash crops. And what these slaveholders were afraid of was that there might be some restriction on them taking their slaves with them if they moved from, say, Georgia to Mississippi. So what do we do about this? The compromise that the framers came up with was a constitutional prohibition of Congress enacting tariffs on exports or export duties, and they kicked the can down the road by promising that there would be no national government actions on the slave trade, one way or the other, for 20 years, which in practical terms means until 1808. With one exception. There could be a tariff or duty paid on imported slaves, and that was capped at $10 per slave. And $10 in this time period is a lot of money, but slaves were also very expensive to import, and so $10 per slave really does not represent a large share of the overall cost of a slave. From those two major controversies, we need to look at some of the other issues that were very critical to the founders' thinking as they wrote the Constitution. And we kind of saw this with some of the references to increased taxation powers, issues of revenue in compromises. Financial and economic problems were front and center in the thinking of the framers. So one of those things is trade wars between states, which was hurting the national economy, really hurting the state economies individually as well, but also threatening the unity of the country. To deal with this, the Constitution very clearly stated that the interstate trade would be under national control in terms of regulation, and states would be expressly banned from imposing duties or tariffs on trade from one state to another. So essentially, now we're going to have free trade within the United States, which is kind of even weird for you to think about, the idea that we would not have free trade within a single country. But prior to the Constitution, there was not free trade between the states in the country. If this class were being taught to Canadian students, they would be like, we know exactly what you're talking about, because within Canada, between the provinces, there have been long-standing prohibitions against, well, not prohibitions necessarily, but long-standing barriers to trade that the individual provinces' governments can impose on each other. But this is not a Canadian class, and so I will cease talking about Canada for now. The upshot here is we have solved very clearly the problem of barriers to interstate trade that we saw under the Articles. Second, the debt crises, both in terms of the national government, but also in terms of individual debtors within the United States. Most people in this time period are debtors, and that's really kind of how it's just always works out. There are more people that need to borrow money. There are fewer people that have lots of money to lend. And so what we have are majority populations of debtors. And we saw that they could become quite hostile and do things like Daniel Shays in Shays' Rebellion, where they sought to influence the legislature to enact policies that were favorable to debtors and very unfavorable to creditors. One of the ways this worked, and not just in terms of Shays' Rebellion, which of course, as we saw, was ultimately a failure, but even peacefully, debtors used their influence as voters to push state legislatures to create individual currencies for the states. Currencies that often became very low value or essentially worthless. And that's how you should think of them, as basically worthless. But what debtors did after pushing state legislatures to create these currencies that became basically worthless, they also pushed those state legislatures to then require that creditors had to accept those worthless currencies as legitimate for repayment of debt. So essentially, if you had debt and you lived in one of these states, you could pay your creditor in a valuable currency like gold, or you could essentially pay them with monopoly money. I think most of us have given a choice, if we're not feeling particularly ethical, if someone gives us the opportunity to pay our debts in worthless currency and keep the good stuff for ourselves, we're going to pay with that worthless currency, which sounds nice for debtors, But as we'll get into this, we'll see that it's not. Another thing that debtors did that's going to, again, seem good up front, but has some very negative consequences on the back end, is that debtors pressured governments to sometimes simply intervene to cancel debt contracts, which means now worthless money or good money, you don't have to pay back anything at all to your creditors. And this, again, as I said, we have negative consequences arising from things that sound pretty good for the majority population who are debtors. But this causes huge credit problems for the early United States. I mean, quite simply, the issue is this. If creditors don't expect to be repaid in good currency, or in the case of cancellation or interference with debt contracts, creditors fear not being paid anything at all, they're just going to stop lending money. That's not a profitable thing for them to do with their wealth. They're not going to lend money to individuals. And if they've been bitten on past contracts and they're now poorer, they simply have less money to lend even when they would want to. And perhaps, for example, lending to the United States government. The Constitution resolved this thorny problem in several ways. One, it limited what states could do. It said states could no longer interfere in lawful contracts. And for the few students that I have in this class that were also previously law and citizen students, we know that lawful contracts are pretty much all contracts. The only contracts that are not would be contracts for illegal things. You can't have a lawful contract to purchase illegal drugs because those goods are illegal and you can't have a contract for their purchase. Or fraudulent contracts. But most contracts are lawful, and Congress is now saying states cannot do anything to interfere in the contractual commitments that debtors and creditors are making. Also said states could not require that paper money would be accepted by creditors for debt repayment. And I know we all deal either with paper money or electronic money now. Matter of fact, most of us probably deal more with electronic money than paper money. But in this time period, coins made out of precious metals, silver and gold, I mean, those are the standard-setting currencies. Whereas paper money, especially paper money created by states, was likely to be worthless. And so the Constitution prohibits states from requiring that creditors accept paper money for debt repayment. And also in regards to the issue of paper money, the new Constitution says, look, there's going to be only one single legal currency, and that will be the currency established by Congress. So both of those things, those give creditors protections that make them more likely to lend money. Another factor is the Constitution explicitly obligates whatever the new central government is going to be to honor the old national debts that were racked up under Continental Congress and under the Articles of Confederation government. So that reassures creditors both within the United States and creditors in foreign countries that the United States is going to be good to its word and it will pay its debts. And all of those things open up flows of credit. And because creditors now know they're going to get repaid, they're going to get repaid in money that they can count on to be worth something. This deals with the debt crises. I know you are all very glad to see the end of this slide because most students, most people in general, are very uninterested in issues of creditors and debtors or financial policy in general. We're still, though, not done talking about the economy. Another issue had been poor economic growth in the original 13 states under the Articles. And this, it's not that it was completely unrelated to trade and credit problems. Those certainly held back economic growth. But here, the focus for kind of turning that economic growth around is that the national government is now going to have more money, more revenue, because in addition to having the same borrowing authority that the Articles government had, its taxing power is now much stronger and clearer. And so there will be more money for the national government. That's going to be used to pay down the national debt, which will free up money for other purposes. One of those being to improve infrastructure. Infrastructure, things like roads, canals, railroads. Of course, we're not talking about railroads in this time period, but things like just roads between communities are going to be important. Soon, canals will be very important from this period in history. Those things are important for economic development. You're seeing that right now with the growth in training of artificial intelligence models. It's a strain on the United States electric grid. That is also infrastructure. When you have good infrastructure, you can have more possibility for economic growth. And we also see that Congress now has, in what we're going to learn as its enumerated powers or listed powers, express powers. We get another place with all those synonyms you social studies students have to deal with. Those powers give Congress the authority to build roads. At this time, I don't want you to think interstate highway. There's a reason if you're driving down the interstate highway, you will occasionally see little green signs with 5 stars on it that says the Eisenhower Interstate Highway System. Eisenhower is the name to tie to that. We don't get that until after World War II. What we're talking about here, really in the Constitution, are postal roads. Meant obviously for the purposes of having a postal service, but other people can use those roads and they can be used for trade, and that helps with economic growth. Another thing that people tend not to get too excited about, not that you guys were excited about roads either, but even less exciting is intellectual property. But the enumerated powers of Congress are, again, those expressed or listed powers. Among them is the power to protect intellectual property, so that if somebody invents something, especially something useful, they can profit off of their invention. If we allow people to profit off of their invention, they're more likely to invent things. The things that they invent can be new ways for us to make things, do things that allow us all to become more wealthy. And so protection of intellectual property is an important power that Congress is given under the new Constitution. Third, Congress has the power to set standards of weights and measures, as we'll see when we get into the Constitution itself in more detail. That is important. Again, not exciting, but important. We want to know that a pound in New York is the same as a pound in South Carolina. That way we know if we're buying a pound of something for a certain price, we know what we're actually getting for the money we've paid. All of this, the upshot, if your eyes are glassing over at the boring details that you reasonably can't get excited about, the upshot is Congress has now been able to improve the business climate and financial conditions for the economy to grow. And that is where we are going to stop for today. When we come back to this, we're going to look at the actual ratification of the Constitution. And just as a bit of a preview, ratification means formally approving something. But again, that's the end for today. Make sure that you complete the Ed Puzzle part of this assignment. If you need to come back and just take notes later, don't want to get back into the Ed Puzzle where you would have to answer questions, I will post a video-only version of this for you to use to fill out your notes or pick up something that you missed the first time.